What happens to a country when silence becomes law? What happens to a child when their past is rewritten? And what happens to a mother who is told her baby never existed? Under Francisco Franco's regime, thousands of children were taken from their mothers, some born in prison, some in hospitals, many handed over through the quiet complicity of state, church, and fear. In this episode, we begin with The Fountains of Silence by Ruta Sepetys, a novel that peels back the veil of life under dictatorship in Francoist Spain, revealing a world of beauty, brutality, and secrets buried just beneath the surface. From there, we turn to the facts, drawn from Lost Children in the Time of Franco and Unearthing Franco's Legacy, to confront a truth Spain is still reckoning with. The systematic abduction of children was not a chapter, it was a policy. And memory, once silenced, doesn't come back easily. Welcome to Gateway Books by Crestance, where we explore the stories that connect historical fiction to the truths of our past and the echoes that still shape our present. I'm Cindy Cruz, your host, and I am grateful to have you with me. If you're enjoying this podcast, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Your engagement helps others find these stories, especially the ones that haven't always had the chance to be heard. In this episode, we turn to Spain. Not the Spain of flamenco postcards or coastal sunlight, but a Spain shaped by fear, silence, and control. A Spain where entire families were rewritten, where children disappeared, not in the dead of night, but in broad daylight, under the weight of paperwork, policy, and power. We began with The Fountains of Silence by Ruta Sepetys, a novel that immerses us in the contradictions of Francoist Spain, a country trying to present itself to the world as stable, modern, and open for business, while burying the trauma of civil war and the machinery of repression still operating behind closed doors. Then we move into the record itself, with Lost Children in the Time of Franco and Unearthing Franco's Legacy, to trace the reality of what happened to the so-called lost children of the dictatorship and what it has taken for their stories to come to light. There are no easy truths here, but the books we're discussing don't look away, and neither will we. They invite us into silence, not to stay there, but to listen more closely to what was hidden, taken, or denied. And that is where we begin. In The Fountains of Silence, Ruta Sepetys gives us a story set in Madrid in 1957, nearly 2 decades after the Spanish Civil War, and still very much in the grip of Franco's dictatorship. But for outsiders, the surface tells a different story. Spain is promoting itself as a tourist destination, open to foreign investment, welcoming to visitors. In reality, the country is held tightly under authoritarian rule, where silence is not just expected, but enforced. Through the eyes of Daniel Matheson, an 18-year-old aspiring photojournalist from Texas, Sepetys introduces us to this uneasy duality. Daniel is staying at the luxurious Castellana Hilton, built with American money as a symbol of Spain's so-called progress. But as he begins to explore beyond the polished lobbies and formal dinners, his camera lens starts to capture something far more complex and far more troubling. The story unfolds through multiple voices, but at the emotional center is Ana, a hotel maid whose life and family history had been shaped by the aftermath of the war. Her parents were Republicans, executed by the regime, and she and her siblings live in a state of constant caution. They are among the thousands labeled Reds, stigmatized and surveilled long after the war's end. Ana is intelligent, perceptive, and careful. A young woman raised in the wreckage of loss. Her relationship with Daniel doesn't begin with romance. It begins with boundaries. She is wary of him, not because of who he is personally, but because of what he represents. A foreigner, American, rich, and naive to the world she inhabits. But as their paths cross repeatedly in the hotel and beyond, something deeper begins to take root. A connection marked not just by curiosity, but by risk. Daniel wants to understand. He wants to capture what's hidden. But for Ana, speaking honestly, Even feeling freely could mean danger. Their relationship becomes a subtle negotiation between privilege and survival. She can't afford to be seen with him, and yet his presence begins to peel back the protective layer she's had to wear just to move through the world. There's another element to Anna's identity that shapes her experience in Francoist Spain: her Romani heritage. In the novel, her mother was of Romani descent, something Anna has learned to keep hidden even from those closest to her. Under Franco, Roma people were persecuted, displaced, and heavily policed. To be both Romani and the child of Republicans was to live with multiple layers of marginalization and multiple reasons to remain invisible. Sepetys doesn't dwell on Anna's heritage as an exotic detail. Instead, it's one more thread in a tightly woven tapestry of secrecy and survival. Anna knows that even her bloodline can be used against her. And so she keeps parts of herself locked away, not out of choice, but out of necessity. Through Anna's memory, we meet Fuga, her childhood friend, who once dreamed of becoming a bullfighter. Fuga is wild, creative, impulsive. He carries with him the kind of energy that doesn't fit neatly into Franco's vision of order. He plays the accordion, paints his face, imagines a future full of color and applause. But dreams like this don't survive easily under regimes built on conformity. Fuga's fate is one of the novel's most painful turns. After an act of rebellion, not grand, but loud enough to be noticed, he's taken away. And he doesn't come back. His absence lingers like a ghost, a reminder to Anna and the others of how quickly someone can vanish when they don't fit the mold. In this way, The Fountains of Silence layers its narrative with disappearances of parents, of children, of friends, of truths. It's not just a story about political oppression. It's a story about what happens when you're forced to bury your identity, to erase your own history, just to stay alive. As Daniel becomes more aware of these realities, his photography shifts. At first, he wants to capture beauty, the Spain of light and architecture, but eventually his lens finds something else: the worn faces of laborers, the fatigue of women in hospitals, the haunted eyes of children in orphanages. He doesn't always understand what he's seeing, but the camera catches it anyway. Quiet documentation of something no one wants him to see. One of the novel's most haunting plot lines revolves around adoption, specifically the ease with which babies are taken from poor mothers and given to Franco-aligned families. Daniel stumbles upon this not through conspiracy, but through curiosity. He notices inconsistencies. He hears rumors, and slowly the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Sepetys based these elements on documented historical practices. During the Franco regime, and even for years after, babies were taken from women deemed unfit, often for political reasons, and placed with Francoist families, sometimes through religious institutions, sometimes through official channels, and often without the consent or knowledge of the birth mother. What began as retaliation against Republican families evolved into a broader system of ideological cleansing and social engineering. In the novel, this is never treated as distant history. It lives in Anna's sister, Julia, struggling to survive in a society that offers no justice. It lives in the hospital scenes, where information is withheld. It lives in the silences between characters, silences that aren't gaps in the story, but part of the story itself. Even the title, The Fountains of Silence, carries weight. Fountains suggest something flowing, something visible. But here, what flows beneath the surface is grief, fear, and the kind of silence that isn't peace, but suppression. Daniel's photographs, taken quietly and often without understanding the full weight of what he's capturing, become artifacts, fragments of truth in a country desperate to hide it. And that, too, mirrors reality. So much of what we know today about the stolen children of Spain comes from individual persistence, from photographs, stories, whispers, and women who refused to forget. Sepetys doesn't resolve these questions neatly. Her novel ends with shadows still in place, but she does something powerful. She invites young readers, and all readers, to imagine what it means to live inside a history that isn't yet finished, to listen closely to voices that were told to be quiet, and to ask, always, who gets to decide which stories are preserved and which are erased? The silences in the fountains of silence are not imagined. They echo a real and devastating history, one that took decades to surface. What Sepetys weaves into her novel through character and suggestions others have uncovered through testimony, investigation, and a relentless pursuit of truth. In the next section, we turn to The Lost Children of Franco, a work that does not fictionalize, but rather exposes. Through it, we begin to understand how the theft of children became a tool of ideological control, and how the stories hinted at in fiction are rooted in fact, often more painful than words can truly hold. There are histories that unfold in public, and then there are those that take place in whispers, behind doors, between documents, in the silences that stretch across generations. Lost Children in the Time of Franco belongs to the latter. It's not just a historical account, it is a testimony, a reckoning, a refusal to allow what was hidden to remain hidden. This book emerged out of a groundbreaking documentary broadcast in Spain in the early 2000s. The authors brought to light a policy that had for decades been obscured by institutional silence: the systematic removal of children from women considered enemies of the Franco regime. The story begins in the years immediately following the Spanish Civil War. Republican women, many of them imprisoned for their political beliefs or simply for having supported the losing side, gave birth in jail under horrifying conditions. These women were told that their babies had died. In reality, many of these infants were taken and given to families loyal to the regime, families who were told they were saving these children from dangerous, unfit mothers. But what started out as a political weapon, punishing women by severing the maternal bond, would evolve into something even more insidious. As the dictatorship solidified its control, the practice expanded into a broader social and ideological project. Children were no longer taken only from prisoners. They were taken from the poor, the unmarried, the devoutly Catholic, who were manipulated into believing the church and state knew better than they did. Lost Children in the Time of Franco brings forward the voices of those who lived through this. The women who were told their children had died, and the now adult children who discovered, sometimes by accident, that they had been adopted under suspicious or falsified circumstances. The book's power lies in its clarity. It doesn't sensationalize. It does not indulge in speculation. Instead, it presents a chillingly well-documented picture. Government records, birth certificates that vanish or change hands, adoption papers signed without consent, priests and doctors who facilitated the process, and a culture of silence that made resistance nearly impossible. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the book is how ordinary these procedures became. Hospitals and maternity homes run by religious orders, particularly the Sisters of Charity and the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, became hubs for these adoptions. In some cases, women were told directly that their child would be taken if they could not pay hospital fees. In others, they were sedated, misinformed, or coerced under the weight of authority and ideology. The children were not only given new homes, they were given new identities. Names were changed. Records were falsified or destroyed. And in many cases, the adoptive families raised these children with no knowledge of the deception involved in their arrival. Others were complicit, convinced they were participating in a noble cause, protecting innocent lives from what the regime branded as moral or political corruption. This was not done in secret, at least not within the structures of power. Judges, clergy, medical professionals all participated, some zealously, others quietly, as part of the machinery of control. The state did not merely tolerate these practices, it designed and upheld them. And yet, for decades, the victims, both mothers and children, carried this pain in silence. Fear, confusion, and cultural pressure kept many from speaking. Others were simply not believed. Some mothers went to their graves wondering if their child had truly died. Some adoptees discovered the truth late in life, when a parent's death revealed a sealed envelope, or a whisper from a neighbor opened a door long closed. The authors of Lost Children in the Time of Franco treat these revelations with the weight they deserve. Each story is unique, filled with longing, anger, disbelief, and an aching need to know who one really is. But together, these stories point to a collective trauma, one not confined to a single generation, but echoing through time. Importantly, the book does not frame these events as isolated tragedies. It names them for what they are: a policy of forced separation and ideological re-education carried with state approval. While the numbers remain uncertain, many records were never kept or were destroyed, conservative estimates place the count in the tens of thousands. Some researchers suggest the number of affected children could be as high as 300,000. The book also explores the limits of justice. In post-Franco Spain, no one was prosecuted for these crimes. The 1977 amnesty law, passed during the country's transition to democracy, effectively shielded perpetrators of political crimes from prosecution. For the families affected, this meant not only living with the loss, but living without recognition or recourse. And yet, there is persistence. The publication of this book, the broadcast of the original documentary, and the work of activists, genealogists, and victims' associations have begun to tear away the silence. DNA databases have been established. New laws have been proposed. Some families have been reunited, and others continue to search. The act of naming, of acknowledging, becomes its own form of justice. Lost Children in the Time of Franco stands as a testament to that effort. It tells us that history is not only written by the victors, sometimes it's recovered piece by piece by those who refuse to forget. The stories in Lost Children in the Time of Franco expose one of the regime's most intimate and devastating violations, but they are also part of a much larger silence. What happened to these children and to the families they were taken from is inseparable from a national legacy of forgetting. In the next book, Unearthing Franco's legacy will confront that broader history, not just the crimes themselves, but the long and often painful process of bringing them to light. What does it take to exhume memories of a country that was told for decades to move on? And who gets to decide which past is remembered and which remains buried? If Lost Children in the Time of Franco confronts the stolen lives of individuals, Unearthing Franco's legacy asks us to look at the ground beneath those stories, literally and metaphorically. Published in 2010, this interdisciplinary volume gathers the work of scholars, historians, and cultural critics to examine how Spain has, and has not, dealt with the legacy of Francoism since the dictator's death in 1975. The focus is not on retelling what happened during the dictatorship, but on how its aftermath has been remembered, rewritten, or resisted. To unearth a legacy is not just an academic exercise. In Spain, it is a political and emotional act, often contested at every level. The term evokes the literal exhumation of mass graves, the search for disappeared relatives, the painstaking work of memory associations, and the public debates that continue to divide Spanish society. But it also refers to something deeper, a confrontation with the past that many were urged to forget in the name of national unity. One of the central arguments of the book is that silence was not simply what remained after Franco. It was a policy in itself, embedded in the very architecture of Spain's transition to democracy. The 1977 amnesty law, passed as a gesture of political reconciliation, guaranteed immunity to perpetrators of crimes committed during the dictatorship. No truth commissions, no trials, no reparations. Spain shows what has often been called a pact of forgetting. This pact was not merely legal. It shaped education, media, and the public discourse for decades. History textbooks largely omitted or glossed over the Civil War and the crimes of the regime. Television and film avoided the subject. Families often out of trauma or fear, did not speak openly about what they had endured. What resulted was a form of democratic amnesia, a country moving forward without having reckoned with where it had been. Unearthing Franco's legacy challenges this silence head on. The contributors examine how the memory of Francoism has surfaced, sometimes cautiously, sometimes defiantly, in literature, film, public policy, and activism. From the work of writers like Javier Cercas to the exhumations led by grassroots memory organizations, the book maps a country still in tension with its past. Several chapters focus specifically on the exhumation of mass graves. Under Franco, an estimated 100,000 people were executed and buried in unmarked pits across the country, their names absent from official records, their bodies denied proper burial. The democratic government that followed did not prioritize locating or identifying these graves. It was left to survivors, children, and grandchildren to push for recognition. These efforts were often met with resistance. Municipal governments denied permits. Church leaders urged forgiveness over excavation. Critics accused memory advocates of reopening wounds that were better left closed. And yet, the digging continued, not only in fields and forests, but in archives, attics, and family testimonies. Memory became a form of activism. Each bone unearthed, each name restored, an act of quiet defiance. The book also explores the cultural dimensions of remembering, how novels, film, and visual art have taken on the work that official histories refused to do. In many cases, fiction became the vessel for truths that could not yet be spoken in public. This mirrors in tone and function what we saw in The Fountains of Silence. Fiction becoming a form of historical recovery when facts were still too dangerous or too suppressed to be named aloud. Importantly, Unearthing Franco's legacy does not romanticize this process. The authors are clear-eyed about the limitations of Spain's memory movement. Progress has been uneven. Political will has been inconsistent. Laws recognizing victims' rights have been passed, then underfunded or ignored. Meanwhile, the Valley of the Fallen, a monument built by Republican prisoners and housing Franco's tomb for decades, remained a national symbol of unresolved memory until his remains were exhumed in 2019, more than 40 years after his death. The legacy of stolen children is part of this broader reckoning. While not every essay in the volume addresses it directly, the theme of rupture, of identity lost and narrative suppressed runs through the entire book. The silence that surrounded the abductions was not exceptional. It was structural, and its endurance speaks to how deeply the mechanisms of forgetting were woven into Spain's post-dictatorship identity. What Unearthing Franco's legacy makes clear is that memory is not static. It evolves. It moves through generations, and it often requires conflict, intellectual, emotional, legal, to surface. The book doesn't offer easy conclusions. Instead, it invites readers to sit with the discomfort of ambiguity. What does it mean to forget without justice? To build democracy without truth? To inherit wounds you did not choose, but still feel responsible to name? One chapter examines the role of descendants, the sons and daughters of the executed, the disappeared, the silenced, who have taken on the work their parents could not finish. For many, memory is not about revenge. It's about dignity, about restoring a name to a grave, about telling the truth so that it can no longer be denied. Another chapter looks at how memory has entered classrooms, or hasn't. In some regions of Spain, students still receive little to no education on the Franco years. The curriculum remains fragmented, often dependent on local politics. As a result, an entire generation has grown up in a country where the recent past remains, at best, incomplete. The dictatorship, if mentioned at all, is often treated as a distant episode, not as the foundation upon which much of modern Spain was built. And so, the work continues, not just by scholars or historians, but by ordinary citizens, mothers searching for children, children searching for origins, archivists, volunteers, and readers. Every uncovered document, every marked grave, Every preserved testimony becomes part of a larger counter-narrative, one that says forgetting is not healing, it is erasure. In its final chapters, the book returns to a core idea that memory is not just about the past, it shapes who we become. The way a nation remembers or refuses to remember defines its values. Its silences are not neutral, they are choices. Unearthing Franco's legacy is not a book of answers, it is a map of questions. How do you rebuild a country on top of mass graves? How do you teach history when so much of it has been hidden? What kind of justice is possible after so much time has passed? And what happens when memory is no longer just private, but public? When it demands space in the streets, the courts, and the curriculum? These are not just questions for Spain. They are questions for anyone living in the aftermath of trauma. In a country where the record has been shaped more by what has been omitted than by what was said. And for those who lived through it or inherited its consequences, remembering becomes not just a moral act, but a deeply personal one. In this episode, we've moved through stories that were not supposed to be told. We began with fiction, with the fountains of silence, where the weight of what cannot be said shapes every gesture, every decision. We followed Daniel's lens as it captured not just images, but truths Spain tried to erase. Then we turned to testimony, to the stolen children in Lost Children of the Time of Franco, and to the families who still search for names, records, answers. Finally, unearthing Franco's legacy, we stood at the edge of silence itself, at the question of how a country remembers what it once demanded be forgotten. What emerges is not just a historical account. It's a portrait of silence used as a weapon and of memory as resistance. In each of these books, we find a quiet defiance. In Anna's fear, in the mothers who never stopped asking, in the activists who still dig. These are not stories of closure. They are stories of persistence, of people who held onto the truth even when the world told them not to. And that, perhaps, is the legacy that matters most. Not the crimes of a regime, but the courage of those who refuse to let them disappear. Thank you for spending time with these stories and for choosing to read, think, and remember alongside us. At Crestance, we believe books open more than just pages. They open conversations, raise questions, and help us carry the past with greater care. If you'd like to explore more, visit crestance.com, where you'll find reading-inspired gear, journals, and thoughtful pieces created for those who see books not just as stories, but as companions. If this episode moved you, we'd love for you to like, comment, or share. Every interaction helps others discover the voices and histories we highlight here, especially the ones that have been silenced for too long. Your presence here matters, your curiosity matters, and we hope you'll stay with us for the next story and the one after that. Until next time.